Every country on Earth is drowning in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. But here's the paradox that should keep you awake tonight. If everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? It's not China. It's not the banks. It's not billionaires hoarding cash in vaults. The answer is far more disturbing, and it's not a conspiracy theory. It's documented history, exposed through contracts, meetings, and mechanisms hiding in plain sight. Let me show you the 4 architects who built a cage around the entire world. In 1694, a failed Scottish merchant named William Patterson stood before King William III with a proposal that would reshape human civilization. Patterson had tried everything: trading schemes in the Caribbean, failed colonial ventures, desperate business deals that went nowhere. At 36, he was running out of options. But on that day, Patterson wasn't pitching another doomed venture. He was offering the king something no one had ever offered before: a loan that would never be repaid. Think about that for a moment. Every loan in human history had 2 possible endings: you paid it back, or you defaulted. The slate eventually cleared. But Patterson proposed something different. He would organize wealthy merchants to lend the English crown £1.2 million. In exchange, the government would pay 8% interest, not until the loan was repaid. Forever. The king, desperate for war funding against France, agreed. The Bank of England was born. And for the first time in recorded history, national debt became permanent, not a problem to solve, but a feature of the system. Here's what most people get wrong about government debt. They imagine it works like personal debt. You borrow, you pay back, you're free. Politicians talk about paying down the debt like it's a goal they're working toward. Economists debate whether debt levels are sustainable, and every few years someone warns that the debt clock is a ticking time bomb. But Patterson understood something these people miss entirely. Debt was never meant to be repaid. It was meant to be serviced. And there's a profound difference between those two things. Margaret Chen still remembers the exact moment she realized something was deeply wrong. It was April 15, 2019, and she was sitting at her kitchen table in suburban Ohio, finishing her tax return. Margaret, 52, had worked as a high school math teacher for 28 years. She'd never missed a payment on anything: her mortgage, her car, her credit cards. She considered herself financially responsible. That night, she calculated that she'd paid roughly $127,000 in federal income taxes over her career. She felt proud of that number. She'd contributed. She'd done her part. Then, out of curiosity, she looked up how much of her taxes went to interest payments on the national debt. The answer was roughly $19,000 of her lifetime tax contributions. Almost 3 years of her total payments had gone not to roads, not to schools, not to defense, but simply to servicing debt that would never shrink. Interest payments on loans that would never be repaid. Margaret didn't sleep well that night. She kept asking herself the same question: if her money was paying interest on a debt that never decreases, where exactly was that interest going? The answer traces back to Patterson's original design. When the Bank of England was chartered, the merchants who provided the initial loan didn't just receive interest. They received something more valuable: banknotes. These notes were backed by the government's promise to pay interest, which was backed by Parliament's power to tax citizens forever. The merchants could trade these notes as currency. They could use them as collateral for more loans. They'd essentially converted the government's permanent debt into their own permanent wealth. Imagine a screen showing the original 1694 Bank of England charter, the handwritten signatures still visible, the wax seals cracked with age, a 300-year-old contract that still binds every taxpayer alive today. But Patterson was just the first architect. What he built was a template. What came next was industrialization. Roberto Vasquez inherited his grandfather's small coffee farm in Colombia in 1978. His grandfather had cleared the land himself, built the farmhouse with his own hands, raised 3 generations on that soil. Roberto was 24 years old, newly married, full of plans to expand the operation. To modernize the farm, Roberto borrowed $40,000 from a development bank, backed by international lenders. The interest rate was 7% manageable. His grandfather had never borrowed a cent in his life, but Roberto was educated. He understood how leverage worked. This was the modern way. Then, in 1979, something happened 4,000 miles away that Roberto couldn't have predicted. Paul Volcker, chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, raised American interest rates to 20% to combat inflation. Suddenly, Roberto's loan, denominated in dollars, didn't cost 7% anymore. It cost 18%, then 22%. His annual interest payment tripled, then quadrupled. By 1983, Roberto had lost the farm. 3 generations of work erased. Not because he made bad decisions, not because coffee prices collapsed, because a man in Washington adjusted a number that rippled across the entire planet. Roberto's story isn't unique, it's the template. And we'll return to exactly how that mechanism works. How a decision in one building can bankrupt farmers on another continent later in this video. Here's an uncomfortable question. What if the financial crises we've witnessed in our lifetimes weren't failures of the system, but features of it? What if the panics, the bailouts, the austerity programs, what if they're not bugs to be fixed, but tools to be deployed? Consider the math for a moment. The United States currently pays roughly $1 trillion per year in interest on its national debt. That's $1 trillion flowing from taxpayers to bondholders every single year. Not paying down principal, not reducing what's owed, just servicing the interest on debt that grows larger regardless. Picture a simple animation, a river of money flowing from millions of small houses into a single massive vault. The stream never stopping, never reversing, year after year after year. Victoria Ashworth Mills manages a $2.3 billion bond portfolio for a pension fund based in Connecticut. She's 44 years old, works 60 hours a week, and considers herself middle class, despite earning $340,000 annually. Her job, in essence, is to buy government debt. "I used to think I was helping retirees," she told a colleague over drinks last year. "Now I realize I'm just part of the plumbing. I take money from workers. I buy bonds. The government pays interest. I distribute it to shareholders. The debt never shrinks. The interest never stops. And somehow this is considered financially healthy." She paused, swirling her wine. "You want to know the dirty secret? Nobody in this industry actually wants the debt paid off. It would destroy us." Victoria understood something that took Margaret Chen a lifetime to glimpse. The system isn't broken. The system is working exactly as designed. And that design stretches back 330 years across 4 architects, each one building on what came before. Each one tightening the trap until escape became mathematically impossible. The first architect gave us permanent debt. The second made it global. The third made it infinite. And the fourth made it inescapable. What you're about to see is how 4 men across 3 centuries built a cage around the entire world, and why the door locked shut long before any of us were born. The first architect gave us permanent debt. The second made it global. The third made it infinite. And the fourth made it inescapable. Now let me show you exactly how each mechanism was built, and why understanding this changes everything you thought you knew about money. Before 1694, lending to kings was a terrible business. You'd hand over your gold, pray they'd win their war, and hope they'd remember to pay you back. Often they didn't. Edward III of England defaulted on his debts to Italian bankers in 1345, destroying the Bardi and Peruzzi banking houses overnight. The Spanish crown defaulted 6 times between 1557 and 1647. French kings routinely executed their creditors rather than repay them. Lending to governments was gambling. Sometimes you won. Often, you lost everything. What most people get wrong about the Bank of England is thinking it was created to serve the public. It wasn't. It was created to solve a specific problem for a specific group of people, wealthy merchants who wanted to lend to the king without risk. Patterson's genius was making the loan permanent. If the principal never came due, the king could never default on it. He could only default on interest payments, which were guaranteed by Parliament's taxing power. As long as England could tax its citizens, the interest would flow. The merchants had converted a risky loan into an annuity backed by the entire nation's productivity. Think of it like this. Imagine you lend your neighbor $1,000. Normally, you'd expect them to pay it back maybe $100 a month for 10 months. But what if instead, your neighbor agreed to pay you $80 every year forever? And what if that payment was guaranteed, not by your neighbor, but by everyone in the neighborhood being legally required to chip in? You'd never get your $1,000 back. But you'd collect $80 annually for the rest of your life. Your children would collect it. Your grandchildren would collect it. The debt would outlive everyone involved. That's the Bank of England model. That's what Patterson built. And within 50 years, every major European power had copied it. Thomas Fairfax was a London wool merchant in 1720, 26 years after the Bank of England was founded. He still remembered his father's stories about the old days lending directly to aristocrats, never knowing if you'd see your money again. Thomas had grown up differently. He'd invested his savings in Bank of England notes, government bonds that paid steady interest. One morning, sitting in his counting house near the Thames, Thomas calculated something that stopped him cold. His annual return from government bonds exceeded what his father had ever earned from direct lending, and Thomas had never lost a penny. The government always paid. The interest always arrived. Thomas told his son that evening, "Your grandfather bet on men. I bet on nations. You'll bet on the system itself." He didn't realize he was describing a trap. Here's the mechanism that made debt global: the Rothschild innovation. Before Nathan Rothschild's sovereign debt stayed mostly within borders. English merchants bought English bonds. French investors bought French bonds. If a government defaulted, it hurt domestic creditors, who might pressure the king for reform. But Nathan Rothschild changed everything with a simple innovation: international distribution. Picture a web spreading across a map of Europe, red lines connecting London to Paris to Frankfurt to Vienna to Naples. 5 brothers in 5 cities moving information and money faster than any government could track. When the British government needed to borrow, Rothschild would buy the bonds in London, then sell them to investors in Paris, Frankfurt, Amsterdam. Suddenly, British debt wasn't just owned by British merchants. It was owned by the entire European financial system. Why does this matter? Because it changed what default meant. Remember Roberto Vasquez from Part 1, the Colombian coffee farmer who lost his grandfather's land when U.S. interest rates tripled. Roberto's debt wasn't held by a local bank. It was held by an international development fund, which had borrowed from European investors who had purchased bonds underwritten by American financial institutions. When Roberto couldn't pay, the problem didn't stay in Colombia. It rippled outward through the entire network. And that network had grown so interconnected that allowing Roberto and millions like him to default threatened banks in New York, pension funds in London, insurance companies in Frankfurt. The Rothschild system made debt too connected to fail. Default anywhere meant crisis everywhere. So here's the question nobody asks: if debt became too dangerous to default on, what happens when countries genuinely can't pay? The answer is the third architect's contribution. Heinrich Schreiber was a clerk at the Reichsbank in 1921 during Germany's Weimar hyperinflation. He was 31 years old, recently married, earning what should have been a comfortable middle-class salary. But prices were doubling every few days. By the time Heinrich walked from the bank to the grocery store, his morning wages had lost half their value. One scene stayed with him forever. A woman ahead of him in the bread line had brought a wheelbarrow full of paper marks to buy a single loaf. While she counted out the bills, someone stole the wheelbarrow. They left the money. Heinrich understood in that moment something most economists still miss. When governments can create money without limit, money itself becomes worthless. But he also noticed something else. While ordinary Germans starved, certain financial institutions thrived. They'd borrowed in marks, purchased real assets, factories, land, gold, and repaid their debts with worthless paper. The lesson was clear: in a system of unlimited money creation, debtors win and savers lose. This brings us to J.P. Morgan and the creation of the Federal Reserve. By 1907, America was an economic powerhouse running on a primitive financial system. There was no central bank, no lender of last resort, no mechanism to create money during crises. When a stock market panic hit that year, the entire system nearly collapsed. Morgan personally saved it. He gathered the major New York bankers in his private library, locked the doors, and refused to let anyone leave until they'd pledged enough money to stabilize failing banks. He was 70 years old. He knew he couldn't do it again. So Morgan and his associates designed a permanent solution. But here's the contrarian truth that changes everything: the Federal Reserve wasn't created to prevent financial crises. It was created to ensure that when crises happened, certain institutions would never bear the losses. Think about what the Federal Reserve actually does. It can create dollars by purchasing government bonds. When the government needs money, it issues bonds. The Fed buys them with newly created currency. The government spends the money. The debt sits on the Fed's balance sheet. There's no limit to this process. None. The government can always borrow more because the Fed can always create more money to buy its bonds. This is what made debt infinite. Before the Fed, there was a natural ceiling on government borrowing. Banks only had so much money to lend. But after 1913, that ceiling vanished. The government could borrow without limit because it had a guaranteed buyer. And who owns the Federal Reserve System? Technically, it's a quasi-public institution. But the regional Federal Reserve banks are owned by their member banks, private institutions. When the Fed earns interest on government bonds, those profits flow through a system ultimately controlled by the banking industry. Here's a simple way to visualize it. Imagine a loop where the government writes IOUs. A private institution creates money to buy those IOUs. The government spends the money into the economy, then taxes citizens to pay interest back to the private institution that created the money from nothing. That loop has been running since 1913. Morgan died in 1913, the same year his creation was born. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December largely because most representatives didn't understand what they were voting for. The debate transcripts show senators asking basic questions about how the system would work. One congressman reportedly said he felt like he was voting on a document written in a foreign language. He was right. It was written in the language of bankers for the benefit of bankers. But even infinite debt has a limit, the limit of belief. The system works only as long as people believe governments will pay interest, even if they never repay principal. And by 1979, that belief was starting to crack. Inflation was running above 10%. The dollar was losing credibility internationally. Foreign governments were beginning to question whether American debt was worth holding. The system Patterson built, Rothschild globalized, and Morgan made infinite, was approaching its first real test. What happened next required a fourth architect, someone willing to make the trap not just permanent, not just global, not just infinite, but truly inescapable. And his solution would crush entire nations in the process. The system Patterson built, Rothschild globalized, and Morgan made infinite, was approaching its first real test. Inflation was destroying the dollar's credibility. Foreign governments were losing faith. And what happened next required a fourth architect, someone willing to make the trap not just permanent, not just global, not just infinite, but truly inescapable. His name was Paul Volcker, and his solution would crush entire nations in the process. In August 1979, Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was 6 feet 7 inches tall, perpetually wreathed in cigar smoke, and possessed a reputation for doing whatever was necessary, regardless of the human cost. His mission was simple: save the dollar. His method would be brutal. Volcker raised interest rates higher than any Federal Reserve chairman in history. The federal funds rate climbed from 11% to 14%, then 17%, then 20%. 20% interest. Imagine trying to buy a house, start a business, or carry any debt at all with rates that high. American farmers lost their land. Small businesses collapsed. Unemployment hit 10.8%, the highest since the Great Depression. The recession of 1981 to 82 was deliberately engineered. Volcker knew it would happen. He did it anyway. But here's what most people get wrong about the Volcker shock. They think it was about saving America. It wasn't. It was about saving the system. Remember Heinrich Schreiber, the Weimar bank clerk, who watched a woman's wheelbarrow get stolen while her worthless money was left behind? Volcker understood that lesson. If inflation destroyed confidence in the dollar, the entire debt structure would collapse. Governments couldn't borrow. Banks couldn't lend. The web that Rothschild had woven across continents would unravel. So Volcker sacrificed American workers to save American creditors. The recession crushed ordinary people, but it restored faith in the dollar. Foreign governments started buying treasury bonds again. The system survived. That was the domestic cost. The international cost was far worse. Maria Santos was 34 years old in 1982, living in Sao Paulo with her husband and 3 children. Her husband Carlos worked at a textile factory that had expanded aggressively during the 1970s, borrowing dollars to buy German machinery. When Volcker raised rates, the factory's debt payments tripled overnight. Maria still remembers the evening Carlos came home silent. He sat at the kitchen table for an hour without speaking. Finally, he said 5 words: "The factory closes next month." Within a year, Carlos was working odd jobs. Within 2 years, they'd lost their apartment. Maria took work as a domestic servant for a wealthy family in Jardines, the same neighborhood where American bank executives lived in guarded compounds, their children attending private schools, their lives untouched by the crisis they'd helped create. That image, Maria cleaning houses, while American bankers lived in luxury, is the system working exactly as designed. Here's the question that should make you angry. When developing nations couldn't pay their debts after Volcker's rate hikes, why didn't they just default? The answer reveals the trap's final mechanism. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make its debt payments. The finance minister delivered the news to American officials in Washington. Mexico owed $80 billion, much of it to Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan. If Mexico defaulted, these banks would face catastrophic losses. Some might fail entirely. The American financial system stood at the edge of collapse. And Volcker had a choice. He could let Mexico default. Banks would take losses. Some would fail. But the system would clear just like it had for centuries when kings defaulted and creditors lost money. The debt would be written off. Mexico could start fresh. Or he could bail out the banks by bailing out Mexico. Pause for a moment and consider what that actually means. American banks had made risky loans to developing countries. Those loans went bad. In any normal market, the banks would suffer consequences for their bad decisions. That's how markets are supposed to work. Risk and reward. Gain and loss. But Volcker chose a different path. He orchestrated a rescue through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would lend Mexico enough money to keep paying interest to American banks. The banks wouldn't lose a penny. Picture a flowchart on screen. American banks lend to Mexico. Mexico can't pay. IMF lends to Mexico. Mexico pays American banks. American taxpayers fund the IMF. The arrow loops back. The banks never lose. But the IMF loans came with conditions, brutal conditions. Mexico had to cut government spending, which meant firing teachers, closing hospitals, ending food subsidies. Mexico had to privatize state assets, selling national resources to foreign corporations at fire sale prices. Mexico had to open its markets, letting American companies compete against devastated local businesses. Mexico had to devalue its currency, destroying whatever savings ordinary Mexicans had left. This was called structural adjustment, a clinical name for economic devastation. And here's the twist. Nobody talks about. The IMF loans didn't reduce Mexico's debt. They increased it. Mexico now owed the original creditors plus the IMF. The debt didn't disappear. It just changed shape, became more permanent, more controlled, more inescapable. The same pattern repeated across Latin America. Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Chile. Nation after nation forced into the same arrangement. Borrow from the IMF to pay Western banks. Accept austerity. Surrender economic sovereignty. Stay in debt forever. Jorge Mendez was an economics professor at the University of Buenos Aires in 1983. He watched his country accept an IMF program after Argentina's debt crisis. He watched the cuts to education, the privatization of utilities, the fire sale of state assets to foreign investors. I taught my students that markets were efficient, he said years later, that bad debts would be written off and the system would correct itself. I was lying to them. The system isn't designed to correct, it's designed to extract. Jorge noticed something else. The same American banks that had made reckless loans to Argentina were now buying Argentine assets at a fraction of their value. They'd created the crisis, been bailed out from the crisis, and were now profiting from the crisis. That's not a market failure. That's the market working exactly as designed for certain participants. Let me ask you something directly. If you lend money to someone who can't pay, who should bear the loss? The obvious answer is you. You made a bad loan. You miscalculated the risk. You should suffer the consequences. But the system these four architects built ensures that creditors never bear losses. When debts go bad, they're restructured. When debtors can't pay, they're bailed out not to help them, but to keep the interest flowing to creditors. When entire countries collapse, they're placed under IMF supervision, not to rebuild, but to extract. The risk is socialized. The profits are privatized. And the debt never disappears. Here's the first unexpected truth. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't a deviation from this pattern. It was the pattern applied domestically. American banks had made trillions in bad loans, subprime mortgages packaged into securities sold worldwide. When those loans collapsed, the banks faced catastrophic losses. And once again, they were bailed out. Linda Morrison was 58 years old in 2008, living in Phoenix. She'd worked as a legal secretary for 31 years, saved carefully, bought a modest home she planned to retire in. When the housing market collapsed, her home lost 40% of its value. She was underwater on her mortgage, owing more than the house was worth. Linda applied for a loan modification. She was denied. She applied again. Denied. She watched the news as the banks that had created the crisis received $700 billion in bailout money. Then she received a foreclosure notice. The bank that foreclosed on Linda had received $25 billion in bailout funds. They had enough money to modify her loan. They had enough money to keep her in her home. They chose not to. Linda lost her house. The bank that took it had been rescued with her tax dollars. That's the rage moment. That's the system laid bare. When banks make bad bets, they get rescued. When ordinary people make bad bets, they get foreclosed. When developing nations can't pay, they get structural adjustment. When Wall Street can't pay, they get trillion-dollar bailouts and bonuses the next quarter. And here's the second unexpected truth. The one that changes everything. The bailouts didn't just save the banks. They made the debt trap permanent. Before 2008, there was still theoretical debate about whether governments should rescue failed financial institutions. After 2008, that debate ended. The precedent was set. Banks would always be rescued. Creditors would never bear losses. The system would never be allowed to clear. David Chen was a risk analyst at a major hedge fund in 2009. He was 36 Harvard MBA, seven-figure salary. After the bailouts, he told a colleague something that still haunts him. "We used to price risk," he said. Now there is no risk, not for us. If we win, we keep the profits. If we lose, the government covers the losses. It's not capitalism anymore. It's extraction with insurance. David left finance 3 years later. He couldn't stomach it anymore. The global debt has grown from $142 trillion in 2008 to $315 trillion today. It didn't grow despite the crisis. It grew because of the crisis. The bailouts proved that debt would always be honored, so everyone borrowed more. Governments borrowed to fund bailouts. Corporations borrowed at zero interest rates. Households borrowed because asset prices kept rising. And all of it, every dollar, every euro, every yen pays interest to the same network of institutions that Patterson, Rothschild, Morgan, and Volcker built. The trap is complete. And if you're wondering why it can never be escaped, why even well-intentioned governments can't break free, the answer is waiting in what happens next. Because the final piece of the trap isn't economic, it's mathematical. And once you see the numbers, you'll understand why there is no political solution, no reform, no way out, that doesn't involve the entire system burning to the ground. The final piece of the trap isn't economic, it's mathematical. And once you see the numbers, you'll understand why there is no political solution, no reform, no way out, that doesn't involve the entire system burning to the ground. Let me show you how the math actually works. The United States currently owes $38 trillion. The average interest rate on that debt is around 3%. That means roughly $1.14 trillion per year goes to interest payments alone, not reducing principal, not paying down debt, just servicing the interest. Now here's the part that should terrify you. The government collects about $4.9 trillion in annual revenue. Almost a quarter of every tax dollar collected goes straight to bondholders before the government can spend it on anything else: roads, schools, defense, Social Security. And that percentage is growing. In 2000, interest payments were $360 billion. In 2010, $414 billion. In 2024, $1.14 trillion. Picture a graph climbing upward at an accelerating rate, the line getting steeper every year, approaching vertical. If interest rates stay where they are and debt continues growing at current pace, by 2034, the United States will pay $1.7 trillion annually in interest. By 2044, over $2.5 trillion. At some point, and this is mathematical certainty, not speculation, interest payments will consume more than the government collects in taxes. What happens then? The government borrows more to pay the interest on old borrowing. Debt grows faster. Interest grows faster. The spiral accelerates. This isn't a crisis waiting to happen. It's a crisis happening in slow motion, invisible, because it kills gradually rather than suddenly. What most people get wrong about debt collapse is expecting a dramatic moment, a crash, a default, a clear before and after. But that's not how the trap works. The trap works through erosion. Each year, a little less money for infrastructure. Each decade, a little more decay. The decline is too slow to trigger alarm, too consistent to ignore in hindsight. Michael Torres was a civil engineer in Detroit in 2008. He was 41 years old, employed by the city responsible for maintaining water infrastructure. That year, his budget was cut 15%. Not enough to cause immediate failure, just enough to defer maintenance. "We stopped replacing pipes that were 80 years old," he said. "We patched instead of replaced. We prioritized visible repairs over invisible ones. Every year the budget shrank, and every year we made harder choices." By 2014, Flint had switched water sources to save money, and lead poisoning began. By 2016, residents were bathing in bottled water. By 2024, the infrastructure Michael once maintained had become a national symbol of decay. The money that should have replaced those pipes went to debt service instead. Not all of it. Just enough year after year to ensure the pipes corroded while bondholders collected interest. Now let me show you what happened to someone on the other side of the equation during that same period. Catherine Wells inherited $2 million from her father in 2008. She was 35 years old, living in Greenwich, Connecticut, recently divorced. Her financial advisor recommended a simple strategy: treasury bonds and municipal bonds. Safe, steady, guaranteed. Catherine followed the advice. She bought government debt. By 2024, Catherine's portfolio had grown to $4.8 million. She hadn't worked a day. She hadn't produced anything. She'd simply collected interest on money the government borrowed, money that came from taxpayers like Michael Torres. In 2034, if current trends continue, Catherine's portfolio will exceed $9 million. Her children will inherit it. They'll collect interest from the grandchildren of people like Michael Torres, who by then may not have clean water to drink. That's not conspiracy. That's compound interest. That's the system working exactly as Patterson designed it 330 years ago. Here's a question nobody in power wants to answer. Why doesn't the government just stop borrowing? The answer reveals why escape is impossible. Remember what happened when Heinrich Schreiber watched Weimar Germany print unlimited money. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. But certain institutions profited by borrowing and buying real assets. The modern system prevents that specific outcome by ensuring governments borrow rather than print. But here's the trap within the trap. If the government stopped borrowing today, it couldn't pay its current obligations. Social Security, Medicare, military salaries all require ongoing borrowing to fund. Stopping means immediate default on promises to hundreds of millions of people. And if the government tried to pay off existing debt, rather than roll it over, the money supply would collapse. Dollars are created when debt is created. Eliminating debt eliminates dollars. The economy would seize. The system is designed so that debt can only grow. Paying it off causes depression. Not paying causes default. The only option is perpetual borrowing and perpetual interest payments flowing upward forever. This brings me to the case that proves escape is impossible. Greece tried to escape. In 2010, Greece faced a debt crisis similar to Mexico in 1982. The government owed more than it could pay. Interest rates on Greek bonds soared. Default seemed inevitable. But Greece was part of the Eurozone. It couldn't print its own currency. It couldn't devalue. It could only accept a bailout and the conditions that came with it. Dimitris Papadopoulos was 52 years old in 2010, running a small construction company in Athens that his father had started in 1968. He employed 23 workers. When the bailout conditions hit, government contracts evaporated overnight. Dimitris let go of 15 employees in 6 months. By 2015, the company was gone. Dimitris was working as a taxi driver, competing with his former employees for the same fares. His son, who'd been studying engineering, dropped out to work at a restaurant. The restaurant closed in 2017. "My father built something from nothing," Dimitris said in 2019. "I inherited it and lost it. My son will inherit debt. 3 generations of work erased to pay interest to German banks." That's not rhetoric. That's what happened. Greek bailout money didn't go to Greek people. Over 90% flowed directly to European banks as debt service. Greeks suffered austerity so French and German bondholders wouldn't lose money. And here's the first unexpected truth about Greece: the debt didn't shrink. After a decade of brutal austerity, pension cuts, hospital closures, youth unemployment exceeding 50%, Greek debt as a percentage of GDP actually increased, from 146% in 2010 to over 200% in 2020. The bailouts didn't solve the problem. They made it permanent. Now contrast Greece with Iceland. Iceland faced a similar crisis in 2008. Its banks had borrowed far more than the country could repay. But Iceland made a different choice. It let the banks fail. It refused to bail out foreign creditors. It prosecuted bankers who had committed fraud. Magnus Sigurdsson was 44 years old in 2008, working as an accountant in Reykjavik. He watched the banks collapse, watched his country's currency lose half its value, watched chaos unfold. Everyone said we were finished, Magnus recalled. The experts said we'd be locked out of global markets forever. They said no one would ever lend to us again. They were wrong. By 2024, Iceland's economy had fully recovered. Unemployment was below 4%. The debt that seemed catastrophic had been written off. Creditors took losses. The system cleared, and Iceland started fresh. Magnus now runs his own accounting firm. He employs 12 people. His children are studying at university, not driving taxis. That's the contrarian point that changes everything. Default works. When debt becomes unpayable, writing it off and starting fresh produces better outcomes than eternal servitude. Iceland proved it. But Iceland is small. Iceland had its own currency. Iceland wasn't integrated into the global debt web the way Greece was, the way America is, the way every major economy is now. For the United States, for Europe, for Japan, default isn't just economically painful. It would collapse the entire global financial system. The debt is too interconnected, too embedded, too essential to how money itself functions. Remember Maria Santos, the Brazilian woman who cleaned houses for American bankers after her husband's factory closed. By 2024, Maria was 76 years old. She'd spent 4 decades working domestic jobs. She'd never recovered what her family lost when Volcker raised rates. Her granddaughter Sophia graduated from university in 2023, the first in the family. Sophia got a job at a Brazilian bank. Her work processing interest payments on government bonds held by foreign investors. 3 generations. Maria's generation lost everything to the debt trap. Her daughter's generation struggled to survive it. Her granddaughter's generation now administers it. The trap doesn't just capture wealth. It captures people. It turns victims into operators. It makes the system self-perpetuating across generations. And here's the final calculation that should keep you awake tonight. $315 trillion in global debt. Average interest rate roughly 4%. That's $12. $6 trillion per year flowing from debtors to creditors. Every year. Forever. Who are the creditors? Asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. They manage over $20 trillion combined. They buy government bonds with pension money, retirement savings, insurance premiums. They collect interest. They take fees. They grow larger. In 2024, the top 3 asset managers controlled more wealth than the GDP of every country on Earth except the United States and China. By 2034, at current growth rates, they'll control more than the United States and China combined. That's not a prediction. That's extrapolation. That's the math of compound interest applied to an inescapable system. The question isn't whether this continues. It's what happens when it reaches its limit. When interest payments exceed government revenue. When the math finally breaks. When the trap snaps shut completely. Because that moment is coming. Not in some distant future. Not for your grandchildren. The trajectory puts it within the next 2 decades, possibly sooner, if interest rates rise, if growth slows, if any number of fragile assumptions crack. What happens then isn't a question of economics, it's a question of power. And the people who designed this system have been preparing for that moment since 1694. So let me bring this back to where we are right now, today, in 2025. The United States just crossed $38 trillion in debt. Interest payments exceeded $1 trillion for the first time in history. The Federal Reserve holds over $7 trillion in government bonds on its balance sheet, money created from nothing to buy debt that will never be repaid. Japan's debt exceeds 260% of its GDP. The European Central Bank has purchased so many government bonds that it effectively finances multiple nations. China's local government debt is estimated at $9 trillion, much of it hidden in shadow banking structures nobody fully understands. And everywhere you look, the same pattern repeats. Remember the 4 architects. Patterson made debt permanent in 1694. Rothschild made it global in 1815. Morgan made it infinite in 1913. Volcker made it inescapable in 1982. Each one solved a problem by tightening the trap. Each one ensured that the next crisis would be larger. The bailout, bigger; the extraction, more complete. Picture a timeline stretching across the screen, 4 points marked across 3 centuries, each one a ratchet, clicking tighter, never loosening, only advancing. Now look at 2020. The pandemic hit. Governments borrowed trillions. Central banks created money at unprecedented scale. The debt that took 200 years to accumulate doubled in 24 months. Was that a crisis response? Or was it the pattern repeating another turn of the ratchet, another expansion of the trap? I promised you we'd return to Margaret Chen, the Ohio math teacher who calculated that $19,000 of her lifetime taxes went to interest payments on debt that never shrinks. I found out what happened to her. Margaret retired in 2023 after 32 years of teaching. Her pension is $3,400 per month. It comes from the Ohio State Teachers Retirement System, which manages $90 billion in assets. Over 40% of those assets are invested in government bonds and fixed income securities. Margaret spent her career paying taxes that serviced debt. Now her retirement depends on that same debt-paying interest. She's both victim and beneficiary, trapped on both sides of the equation. When I explained this to her, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I haven't been able to forget. So I paid into a system that used my money to buy debt, and now I need that debt to keep existing so I can survive retirement. If the system collapses, I lose everything. If it continues, my grandchildren pay for my survival. She paused. That's not a pension. That's a hostage situation. Margaret understood something most economists won't say publicly. The system has made almost everyone complicit. Pension funds, retirement accounts, insurance policies all depend on government debt paying interest. Collapsing the debt trap would collapse the retirement security of hundreds of millions of people. The trap isn't just financial, it's social, it's generational. It binds the old to the young, the saver to the borrower, the victim to the system that victimized them. Here's the contrarian truth that nobody wants to hear. There may be no solution that doesn't involve massive pain for ordinary people. Default destroys pensions. Inflation destroys savings. Austerity destroys services. Every exit from the trap leads through suffering, and the people who designed the trap have arranged it so that they suffer last, if at all. Victoria Ashworth Mills. The bond portfolio manager from Part 1 still manages $2.3 billion. When I asked her what happens when the math finally breaks, she gave me the most honest answer I've heard from anyone in finance. The people at the top already own real assets, land, commodities, infrastructure. When paper wealth evaporates, they'll still have something. The people who only have paper savings accounts, pensions, 401ks, they'll have nothing. That's not a prediction. That's just how it works. That's how it's always worked. She finished her wine. The question isn't whether there's a reset coming. The question is who gets reset and who stays standing. So what do you do with this information? I want to be clear about something. This video isn't financial advice. I'm not telling you to buy gold or Bitcoin or ammunition. I'm not selling a newsletter or a course on surviving the collapse. The people who make those pitches are usually running their own extraction schemes. What I'm offering is simply a framework for seeing. When you hear politicians debate the debt ceiling, ask yourself who benefits from this theater. When you see central banks announce new policies, ask whose interest does this serve. When the next crisis hits and bailouts flow, ask who's being rescued and who's paying for it. Picture these 3 questions appearing on screen, one by one, simple white text on black, each one landing with weight. The system isn't hidden. The mechanisms are public record. The meetings happened. The contracts exist. The math is available to anyone willing to look. What's hidden is the pattern, the way each piece connects across centuries, The way each crisis tightens the trap. The way each solution creates the next problem. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Roberto Vasquez. The Colombian farmer who lost his grandfather's land when Volcker raised rates. I tried to find out what happened to him. The trail went cold in 1987. His farm is now owned by a multinational agricultural corporation. The coffee still grows. The profits flow elsewhere. 3 generations of work erased. The land remains. The family is gone. The debt was repaid not by Roberto, but by everyone who came after him. That's the system. That's the trap. That's what 4 architects built across 3 centuries. And here's what I keep coming back to, the thought I can't escape. Patterson, Rothschild. Morgan, Volcker. None of them were evil. They were solving problems. They were protecting interests. They were building structures that worked exactly as intended. The trap wasn't built by villains. It was built by rational men making rational decisions that happened to benefit themselves and the institutions they served. That's what makes it so durable. There's no conspiracy to expose no villain to defeat no single point of failure to attack. The system is emergent, self-reinforcing, distributed across millions of participants who each act in their own interest while collectively tightening the trap. The only thing that can break it is the same thing that's always broken such systems throughout history. The math eventually fails. The extraction exceeds what the host can bear. The confidence that holds it together evaporates. When that happens, not if. When the question becomes who understood what was happening and who was caught by surprise. This video won't save you. Understanding won't protect you. But it might help you see clearly when the fog machines are running, when the theater is performing, when the next turn of the ratchet is being sold as salvation. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 trap. They didn't teach you this in school. They taught you debt is a problem governments are trying to solve. But the architects knew better. Debt isn't a problem, it's the product. And you're not the customer, you're the collateral.